Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the FRSecure CISSP Mentor Program, class number 3. Very excited to be here with you guys tonight. Oh, good Lord, we got feedback. Hold on. Good Lord. All right, that's my fault. Sorry about that. Always a technical difficulty when we're getting these things going, especially if I'm running it. Good God, we're doing it again. What happened? All right, I'm getting feedback. Sorry about this. Pause 1 second. All right, back with you, hopefully this time without any feedback. Again, I do apologize for that. Too many Zoom windows open at once. I'm your instructor, Ryan Cloutier. Full disclaimer, I am on about 2 hours of sleep, 10 energy drinks, and a whole big bag of passion for teaching you guys this tonight. So I'm gonna try to make it entertaining. We've got a lot to cover. All right. Oh my goodness. This time without any Okay, at this point, I think maybe my fellow instructors are messing with me. I've closed all the windows. We should have no more feedback. Good Lord. Okay, apologize for all that. Let's start over. So I'm Ryan Cloutier, your instructor for tonight. We're going to go through a lot of content to wrap out and close out domain 1. A couple housekeeping reminders here. Let's keep the online chat adult, professional, and clean. Let's be respectful of each other. No discussion of religion, politics, or really anything else that's not relevant to the CISSP program or what we're covering here this evening. And as a strong reminder, please do not share any copywritten material within the Slack channels or in the Zoom tube. You can tell I've been up for a while, YouTube chat, or any other place really associated with the mentor program. We do want to respect the law and respect the hard work folks have put into those materials that may be copywritten. So getting into it now, quick agenda. We'll go through a bit of a bumpy welcome that we just had. Quick introduction of myself and who I am, what I'm about, why I'm here. Cover a couple of the most common questions that we've been seeing. We'll do a quick refresher and then a slight deep dive into policies. And then really the meat of tonight's conversation is going to be around business continuity, personnel, security considerations and risk management, third-party supply chain controls, risk management as a discipline in practice and all the associated frameworks that go with it. And then lastly, we're going to end with security awareness. If we have a little bit of time left towards the end, we may lightly scratch on domain 2, but this is such an important topic and really lays the foundation for the rest of the coursework that we're going to go through that I wanted to make sure we really took a little bit of extra time tonight, especially around the business continuity and risk management piece of it, since it really does set the stage for the remainder of the course. I am currently listed as Evan Francine in the Zoom. That is because I am using Evan's Zoom to do this, but let me go ahead and make a quick change there if I can. Otherwise, just know I am not Evan. I have nothing but respect for Evan. And this week I tried a little bit to be like Evan, and I can assure you, don't do that. He probably works harder than all of us combined some days. So quick background on me. Nice to meet all of you. I see that we have folks here from all over the world, representing many different countries, different backgrounds, different experiences. And that is just so important to having a well-rounded group of security professionals. Risk is very personal to individuals and very personal to business. And so the more representation we can have and the more diversity that we can have in the security professional practice, the better off everyone's going to be. So again, Ryan Cloutier, I am your instructor for this evening. I am the president of Security Studio. one of Evan's companies. I have the privilege of running a security studio. I'm a virtual chief information security officer. Serving the underserved is my passion. I do this work because I care, because I want to serve those who traditionally have gone underserved or unserved. My superpower is speaking human about technology. So taking some of these more complex technological conversations and topics and translating that into a more accessible and easy to access common language for our non-technical folks, which at the end of the day represent the largest group that are affected by security. It's not the security practitioners so much that we need to be concerned about educating as it is the humans. So that's my superpower. I co-host a couple of podcasts, Security Shit Show and Security Simplified. I co-host both of those with Evan Francine, the man behind this program. I'm an InfoSec missionary, helper and a protector at heart, and hopefully that'll shine through tonight. I've been published in a multitude of trade magazines and news articles and such. I've co-authored several academic papers, and I advise many. But most importantly, I'm passionate about your success. Believe it or not, I'm one of those rare people that genuinely does care about the success of others, a lot of times above and beyond my own success. I really do believe in servant leadership, and not as a buzzword, but as in a lifestyle. And whether that's leading in a business setting, in a personal life setting, or just, helping out some stranger on the road. I absolutely have a soft spot for those who help. My passion area where I spend a lot of my time is K-12. They are just a wonderful group of humans with such a heart for helping others. And, a lot of times they don't have the necessary resources. So on a personal side, I'm a blacksmith, I'm a Lego nut. I'm an analog human attempting to live a digital life. I'm into old school vinyl LP albums. My house is very dumb. I don't have any smart tech in my house. It's not that I don't appreciate it. It's just I like to, when I'm not at the keyboard, I like to live a little bit of a slower, more analog kind of life. I am a believer and a follower. I'm a husband, I'm a father, I'm a continuous learner, and some have told me I may actually be the Energizer Bunny in human disguise. If you want to talk to me or reach out, you can find me at my LinkedIn here. My Twitter's up on the upper right there. And that's enough about me. Let's get into this. So a couple study tips that I want to touch on tonight. Study in small amounts. Try to do that frequently. 20 to 30 minutes at a time is probably the most in a single setting. When we try to really push hard and get, several hours worth of learning in, a lot of times we're going to find ourselves getting fatigued and forgetting a lot of what we learned instead of retaining it. Another thing that can be very helpful is the use of flashcards and practice tests or practice apps. I know when I was studying for the CISSP, anytime that I had downtime, standing in line at the grocery store or, just a lot of waiting around at airports, waiting in the security line or things like that, I would use that opportunity to take out my flashcard app and just practice a little bit. And I found in doing that I was able to quickly retain the information, and not just a memorized retention, but actually remembering why it mattered. Try to take naps after heavy topics. When we get into security models, you'll definitely know what I'm talking about. Sleep has been shown to help you form memory retention. And really after a large amount of study of new material, it's just a good idea to take a break, take a rest, write things down and say them out loud. This is actually a security awareness technique as well. And I'll get more into that a little bit later, but when you write something down, you actually engage a different part of your brain. So, when you hear it with your ear, it goes into one section. When you see it with your eye, it goes into another section. And when you write it back down, you're actually triggering another part of your brain. Same thing if you say it out loud. So the more areas of your brain that you can engage when you're retaining this information, the more likely it is to stick. Please do use the Slack channels. And again, quick refresher, be respectful, be kind to each other, try to support each other. And then, exercise and get some fresh air in between study sessions. I know at the end of tonight's class, I'm going to take a nice little walk around the block with the dog. and then I am taking a nap. So big shout out to Ron for stepping in last week. You know, short notice, he jumped in to help cover one of our other instructors who was unavailable. He did a great job, left me in a good position to pick up from where he was at and keep moving forward. And then Ron, I don't know if you know the page number that you maybe ended on, but if you could throw that in the chat for folks, that is one thing I think I forgot to write down. So the week, you know, weeks go by very fast. It's very easy to forget what happened. You know, the joke is for me, it's December 999,099 of 2020. You know, that's going to happen to all of us. So notes are really helpful. Hopefully everyone got a chance during the downtime to get in a little bit of study time. You know, and want to check in with you. Please let us know in the chat, you know, how are you doing? You know, what's your experience so far with the program? You know, if you have questions, if you're struggling with things, you know, definitely, you know, interact with us in the chat and we'll get that to you. You know, one of the things we'd like to know is, you know, how many of you have successfully read the entirety of domain 1 and possibly even started on domain 2. And as always, you know, ask the questions. Again, most common thing we're hearing, you know, is in regards to the Slack channel. We're putting links now in the YouTube chat for you. So if you don't have the Slack channel, go ahead and join that now. You know, the way Slack works is you're going to get this invite. Possibly the invite is expired. If it has, please email us at CISSPmentor@FRSecure.com and we'll gladly get a new invite out to you. The other big question that's been very common is about the session links. And we definitely have had some hiccups there, but we're working through that. And you should get an email the same day as the session with the session link. Friendly reminder, please do check your junk folder or spam folder. Sometimes it can go there, unfortunately. And then lastly, the slide decks. So slide decks are provided at the completion of the class. If the instructor has them available. Thankfully, I did not have to build any quizzes into this particular deck, but there will be quizzes. And so a lot of times what will happen is we'll provide the non-quiz deck early on, and then at the completion of the class, we'll follow up with that quiz deck. But all of us do work full-time jobs in addition to helping out here with the mentor program. And so sometimes there can be a delay. We ask for your grace and patience. All right, so before we get too deep into it, let's get a dad joke out of the way. Why do skeletons never take any risks? Because they have no guts. I'm hearing all the laughter right now. Everyone's chuckling hard from that one. All right. Just a reminder, very important reminder, the definition of information security. So everything that you're going to learn over the next few weeks through these courses is rooted in learning the skills needed to promote, support, and defend information security. So being on the same page about what that is and what that means is super important. It's about managing risks to the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of information. And the way that we do that is by using administrative, physical, and technical controls. Technical controls traditionally have gotten all of the attention. But the reality is it's those administrative controls more often than not that actually increase the security and reduce the risk, right? Because it's a human element. And administrative controls speak to the human side of security. So diving into kind of policies and policy related documents, organizational policies should reflect any compliance requirements that you have, whether this is a regulatory body, a legal authority, it could be being compliant with the internal company policies. But we want to make sure that when we're designing policies for the organization, and specifically information security policies, that they do reflect the requirements that we have. You know, we may have contractual requirements that we need to meet either on behalf of a customer or someone else that we're representing in a contractual relationship. Now, where a lot of organizations have struggled is making sure the policy is actually effective and enforceable. You can write the greatest policy in the world. Thou shalt not do the following things, and thou shalt do the following things. But if it's not practical for the organization, if it's not enforceable, it's not effective. At that point, it is not very useful. So we want to make sure that not only is it aligned to and reflecting any compliance requirements we have, but that they're also effective and enforceable. We want policy that's the right size, that actually works and addresses the risk. Security folks have a tendency to want to be smart and right. And tonight we will see a lot of fancy words, a lot of concepts that are very ethereal and high level, and they're great. But in some cases, they're not effective, especially if we're trying to connect with regular, everyday people who just want to know how to stay safe online. So diving a little bit into this, and this is picking up a little bit of where Ron left off last week for us, is policy. Now, policy is mandatory. Okay, we have it and we have to adhere to it. All policy should, if it's developed correctly, if it's effective, should have a purpose. Why does it exist? Why did we do this? Scope. What is the policy speaking to? What is it trying to address? Any responsibilities that exist within the policy. If someone has an action item, or a department has an action item, or there's an audit requirement, or any of those things, what are those responsibilities? And then it should also help us understand how we're going to be compliant with the policy. How do we know if we're actually doing the things that the policy says we're doing? So we want to make sure that we've got purpose, scope, responsibilities, and compliance accounted for in any policy document we create. Now, there's different types of policy. There are program policies. These are going to be broader in nature, security program, human resources program, different higher level overarching, in this case, the enterprise information security policy program. Then we're going to have issue specific policy. This is policy that's going to speak to a specific issue. Acceptable use is a good example. That's a specific issue type policy that falls under a broader program policy. And then we will have system specific policies. So this could be, for example, speaking to how we configure a Windows machine or a Linux machine, right? Those are going to be very specific to the system they are and may not be applicable to the larger issue or the larger program policy. So want to talk through a couple of the policies here we have in front of us, and then we're going to get into the differences between a policy, a supporting standard, a guideline, and a procedure. Each one of these terms does have a different meaning. Each one of these terms has a different level of enforceability. And one caveat to call out, and this is for any of my K-12 people that might be listening, an information security policy is not the same thing as a school board policy. The two should not be confused. They are very different. And for those of you that are not in K-12, that's an important distinction to understand. The word policy could mean something different to different organizations, groups, or industries. So make sure that you're checking in on that and that you understand, if you're going to use this term, how it may already be in use within those industries or how it may be understood by those you're trying to help. And a popular belief is everyone must read all the policies, and it's just not true. You need to be aware of the policies that you are responsible for being compliant with. You do not need to read policies for things that you don't have anything to do with at all, or that you don't have any responsibility to be compliant with. So for example, if you are in the if you're in the HR department, you need to be very familiar with the employee policies, but you probably don't need to know what the encryption policy is for removable drives, right? That's going to be very narrow and specific. That's going to be one of those system specific or issue specific type policies, and doesn't necessarily need to be read. Everyone should be aware of where to find policies. So while not everyone needs to read them, everyone needs to know where to find them. So let's break this down a little bit further. Procedures come in mandatory, right? Or discretionary. So a procedure could be, you have to do it this way, or it could be, you could do it this way. And as you navigate the world of information security, you are going to find there's a whole lot of, you could this way, or you could that way. As we get into some of the terms tonight, we're going to cover, 5 different ways to say the same thing. Unfortunately, that's part of the complexity problem that InfoSec as an industry has. But they, you need to be clear as to whether they're mandatory or discretionary. And anybody looking for policies, you can go to securitystudio.com. We've got the full set of those enterprise policies that I showed on the previous slide available on the website, template form. You don't even have to register with an email. Feel free to grab them and use them. So backing up a second here, and again, a little bit of energy drink and a whole lot of staying awake. I want to talk a little bit about these quickly. So a couple of the key policies that we absolutely positively want to have, and really we should have all of these policies, but if we had to start somewhere, acceptable use. Is everyone in the company, in the organization, aware of what appropriate and acceptable use of information, systems, and internet connections is? Most of this is going to be found in your employee handbook, but it's very important that folks are very clear on that. We probably want to have a policy for business continuity, for backups, for disaster recovery. Ron, can you throw in the chat for everybody the securitystudio.com address with the policy URL, please? Thank you. Network configuration, very important as well. Data classification, probably very important. Vendor management, super, super important. Risk management, super important. So you can start small and grow. And that's a theme, as you do this job, that's a theme you should be very comfortable with. What can I do today? How far can I move the needle now? Because I can always go back and improve it later. I can always go back and expand it, enhance it, make it better. But we got to start somewhere. So, starting small a lot of times helps you make rapid progress. I know early on in my career, I would, if I was to take this on, I would try to, okay, I got to get all of these done at once. Well, then none of them get done. But if I just pick one off the list and I get it, purpose defined, scope defined, responsibilities and compliance defined, then I'm able to kind of move forward with that. All right, so back to procedures. Again, mandatory or discretionary. And what a procedure is going to give you is a step-by-step guide. It is, do this, then do that, then do this. So for example, if I'm building a new cloud service, I'm going to want to make sure that I first start with, spinning up a known good secure image. And the steps to do that are go to the image repository and select the image and then click install. Right? I'm going to want to make sure I've configured the network securely. So that's that step-by-step guidance of what to do. A standard is going to be mandatory as well. A standard is going to be, this is how we need to meet this. So it's very specific to the use of technology. When I'm configuring a particular system, I'm configuring it to this standard. I have turned off, these features, these capabilities. I've made sure these things are installed. I've done these additional steps to be sure that I'm adhering to the standard. And standards are very important in information security because standards are what allow us to have consistency. And we'll talk more about consistency later, but the more consistent we are, the easier it is for us to mitigate and manage the risk. Guidelines are generally going to be discretionary in nature. That's kind of that you could or you couldn't. They tend to be advice and advisory based. And then baselines and benchmarks. These also are discretionary. They're generally uniform methods of implementing a standard. Think of that as like your minimum. your bare minimum. So looking at it another way, if we look at the kind of the pyramid here, guidelines are that FYI, okay? Hey, generally good information you might want to know about. Procedures are going to tell us the how and the who. So how are we doing it and who's involved and what is that, the humans kind of piece of it. Standards are going to tell us the what, and policies are going to tell us the when and the why. And it does look like you guys took down the website. Good job. Thank you very much. Actually, that's really cool to see. I'll be bragging about that to Evan later. So guidelines, procedures, standards, and policies. Know this and know where we're at. Bottom line, policies, definitely want them. Standards are going to help you to be consistent. Procedures are going to help you to make sure that you're meeting your standards consistently. And guidelines can help give you different ways to approach it. And then baselines. Baselines are the absolute minimum, bare minimum. And we'll talk more about bare minimum a little bit later on. But know that, that's the starting line. Anything below that is far too risky. So yeah, study up on that stuff. Okay, business continuity and business impact analysis. This is such an important part of what you're going to learn. This really does inform you in so many ways for the remainder of what you're going to learn throughout this program. Without understanding what the impact of any given risk is to the business, it's very difficult to manage the security of it, to manage the risk of it. It's so many of us have gotten into, okay, let's throw a firewall at it. Let's throw antivirus at it. Let's do all these things. And these are, okay things to do. But if we're doing it without an understanding of how that's helping the business, of how that's what the impact of that particular system is to the business, we may be spending too much time and money on security controls that aren't necessary and aren't really adding any additional risk relief. Or we might miss an opportunity to increase the security controls for a device or a system or an asset that is maybe more impactful to the business if something happens. So the book tells us that the goal of the business continuity plan is that the business needs to be able to continue to operate before, throughout, and after a disaster event. Business continuity planning and disaster recovery planning are very different disciplines that go together. Basically, the business continuity plan is what you're going to run to keep the business going while executing the disaster recovery plan to get back to normal operations. Business continuity plans should focus on the business as a whole, and they should provide you a long-term strategy for running the business. The cloud can and does go away. So what are you going to do when that happens? Business continuity isn't just about security. It could also be about dealing with things like supply chain interruption. Okay, if we have another supply chain interruption, another pandemic breaks out, how are we going to maintain continuity of business? The BCP will help you to figure that out. You should account for items such as people, process, technology, systems, and data. So going into this a little bit deeper, the business continuity plan is that long-term plan. And then another name that you'll run into is continuity of operations plan. These are the same thing. We love to describe things 10 different ways in the world of IT and InfoSec, but they are identical things. A disaster is any disruptive event that interrupts normal system operations. So the disasters can be physical, they can be virtual, they can be self-induced, it can be hacktivism. I mean, there's just a million different things that can cause a disaster, but understand that it's any disruptive event. A disaster recovery plan is a very short-term plan to get back on your feet, to restore to normal operations or minimum normal operations as quickly as possible following a disruptive event. Then we'll go deeper into that in chapter 7. Some other terms that you should be familiar with and memorize is critical business function. And a little bit of acronym soup tonight, CVF, critical business function. This is any function that is critical to the business. Interesting point here is that a critical business function is anything that the absence of would cause the business to stop or would cause the business to be severely interrupted. If you go to the user base and say, what are the critical business functions? They will gladly tell you it's every single tool they use all day long. But the reality is it's probably not those things. It's probably some other systems. And in a lot of cases, systems that we don't necessarily recognize as being part of the business. Some certain cloud services or other third-party services can be part of that critical business function, but we might not be thinking of them that way. The way that we're going to kind of get our head around all this is by conducting a business impact analysis. So this is looking at the impact of an event over time disruption. So what is the impact to the business at 1 hour of the event, at 3 hours, at 5 hours, at 10 hours, at 2 weeks, 10 days? So we want to look at the impact of the event over time of the disruption. Maximum tolerable downtime, or MTD, is the total length of time that any critical business function can be unavailable before getting into a more disastrous situation. And the maximum acceptable outage is the total length of time a critical business function can be unavailable to the business. Some other terms, recovery time objective, RTO. So that's the maximum time to restoration of minimum service expectations. And it must be less than or equal to mean MTD. The recovery point objective, or RPO, is the amount of loss that we're comfortable with, the amount of data loss that we're comfortable with in a given time period. While these two acronyms are not testable, they are notable. So OMG, that's going to be the feeling you have if you have to execute a business continuity plan. And FML is what you're going to yell out if you did not print the plan out ahead of time. Please print your plans and test them. All too many times, that has been the thing that's caused more disaster. Acronym soup, welcome to it. So quick visual for you of what we're talking about. So if we're looking here, we've got a backup that's occurred. We should be making our backups, hopefully. And then the recovery point objective is the amount of data we lose between the last known good backup and the disaster event. Downtime is where the recovery time objective comes into play. And that's the amount of time between the disaster and when we expect to recover. And then MTD is going to span that. That's at maximum tolerable downtime. So when we get to this required recovery piece, we have to be back up and running. Anything past the maximum tolerable downtime generally will result in some type of significant harm. Okay. Very important to understand this. I took extra time on this because I did not feel the current material spoke deep enough on this topic. And this topic is so critical to every other risk decision that you will make as you go through your career. So conducting a business impact analysis. Formal examples for determining how disruptions would impact the organization. So, we want to be realistic in this. We want to actually map this out. So what happens if the data center floods? What happens if we get ransomware? What happens if the one computer that's wrapped in duct tape that has been running the critical business functions for the last 5 years finally dies? What are we going to do? So the business impact analysis should be the place where we're asking these questions and we're doing an analysis to identify what are those critical IT systems and components, how important are they to the business, order of operations, all these kind of things will come out of a BIA. What do I restore first? What do I restore second? What has to be back in 1 hour? What can be back next week? Will come out of this business impact analysis. And then the output of a business impact analysis is going to allow the business continuity plan and disaster recovery plan project manager to fully characterize the IT contingency requirements and priorities. All business impact analysis plans and continuity plans must have management support. C-level managers have to agree to any plan set forth. If a plan does not have a managerial support at the highest level, that plan is not enforceable. It's not actionable. So we want to make sure that the C-level managers are in full agreement with any plan. We also need them to support any of the action items. We may need them to make people go to work. We may need them to activate people on the weekend or spend money or activate outside services. So we want to make sure that they are in full support to agree any action items that we have that might require their support. It's going to, when we're talking about C-level, we're talking about the CEO. We're talking about the chief operations officer. We're talking about the chief information officer, the CFO. Almost never are we talking about the CISO. The CISO is going to be busy helping out with this stuff, but the CISO at the end of the day isn't the one that needs to take those actions. It is the CEO, COO, CIO, and CFO. Whoever that C-level is, they must have enough power and authority to speak on behalf of the entire organization and interact with outside media. We'll get more into that later on in the course, but what we say to media matters, and who does the talking matters more. And again, they need to be high enough in the org to be able to commit resources. So all planning starts with developing, documenting, and scoping. What is in scope? What are we trying to protect? We can't protect everything. So what's the most important stuff? And how are we going to go about addressing it, protecting it? In which emergency scenarios are we going to account for? So for example, I live in Minnesota. We don't do hurricane planning. None of my systems have a hurricane plan. If a hurricane shows up in Minnesota, we have far bigger issues on our hands. And so we don't deal with that risk. We do, however, look at things like what happens if there is a blizzard? What happens if there's a loss of power to the heating system in the winter? That could be a health, life, and safety event for people, and we might need to send people home. Here in Minnesota, it does get cold enough in the wintertime that you could potentially be at physical risk, up to and including freezing. Literally, like freezing happens to a handful of people each year. So we want to make sure we've accounted for these things. We need to know what's in and out of scope for the plan. The scope is what's going to allow us to stay focused, take action, budget, and be effective. So we want to control that scope. Once we've gone through this, we want to get sign-offs from the C-level and then go take that plan to gather input from the rest of the organization. So once C-level kind of says, yep, I'm good with kind of the scope, then we're going to go to the rest of the organization to work through the details for the objectives and the deliverables. Objectives are generally going to be if-then statements. So back to that hurricane, right? We're gonna execute the physical relocation and employee safety plan. That may be applicable to one location, but not all. So we're going to look at that. We're going to do those if-then statements. If this happens, then we're going to do this. All objectives, an objective would be to create the plan and then have it reviewed by the organization by a specific date. We don't want open-ended stuff here. We want to have sign-offs. We want folks to review it by a particular date. This helps us to enforce accountability. This also helps us to stay compliant and manage risk in real time. The objective will have a number of deliverables that come out of it. In order to properly create the plan and vet the plan, we probably have to create some documentation. We're probably going to have some meetings. Ideally, you should be testing these things, right? You should be doing tabletop tests and other tests. An untested plan is not a plan that's going to work when you need it. Scoping the project. Again, we need that executive management support. They need to sign off on the initiation of the plan, and they need to sign off on the final approval of the plan. They have to do this to demonstrate due care and due diligence. Ultimately, they will be held liable under any applicable law or regulation that this plan may be part of. So, for example, human safety, human life safety, that's something that, we have laws about that. And so any component of a plan that includes that, leadership could potentially be held accountable. So here's a basic example scope. Critical business functions, threats, vulnerabilities, and risks, data backup and recovery plan, the personnel to execute the business continuity plan, a communications plan. How are we staying in touch with each other if our primary communication channels are down? Do we have alternative communication channels? Do we have people's cell phone numbers? Is any of this wrote down anywhere? And has any of this been printed out so we can actually get to it when we need to? And then one that's often overlooked, and that's why I highlighted it for you. The actual testing requirements of the plan should be built into the plan. So just like with policies, we want to make sure that the enforceability piece of the policy, the compliance piece, is present in the BCP plan. We want to make sure we've accounted for testing requirements. Cannot stress this enough. Without exception, human life and safety is above everything. If ever you're in a situation where it is anything being weighed against human life wins every single time, absolutely, without a doubt. So start with human safety, make sure that's good, and then move on from there. People are defined as any living human being that could be affected by the event. So this could include people outside of your organization. This could be the community, depending on the nature and type of the event. If you work in a gas and oil processing facility and you have a cyber event that results in a physical situation, that could physically affect that community. So also, this is very testable. So number one, most important, no exceptions, human life trumps all. Make sure to account for notifications, communications, multiple methods. I talked about that just a moment ago. What are the resources? Alternative working locations, food. People got to eat, and we don't think about these things, right? We don't think about, hey, do we have food available if we take everybody out of our main office and we relocate them to somewhere else? Is there enough equipment available to us to get people back up on their feet? Let's say we had a physical disaster and we lost equipment. Have we accounted for extra secondary equipment, internet connections, really any supplies, pens, papers, any of that stuff? We need mechanisms to provide regular updates to leadership. We need notifications of external parties that may be affected. Okay. Some processes we're going to need to build out is, what resources need to be available? How are we going to maintain critical operations? What are the logistics for moving the humans and the technology and the computers and the supplies around? We need those resources to be continuously available. So if the plan is, I'm going to run on my Wi-Fi hotspot on my 1 gig plan, and then you get to 1 gig and then you get kicked off your plan, you now don't have that continually available resource. So make sure those resources are available throughout the duration of the continuity plan being exercised. We'll cover recovery sites in Chapter 7. Traditionally, they come in hot, warm, and cold. Really what that's saying is how quickly that site is brought into a usable state. The more usable the site is, the more expensive it is. We'll talk more about striking that balance a little bit later. And again, test and update your plans. A tested plan is a plan you can count on, and a plan kept up to date is a plan that's going to work when you need it. Now, an extra slide I threw in here because I think this is important and the book didn't cover it, is actually bringing together the team of humans who are going to do the project planning. You want to involve stakeholders from across the organization. This is not an IT exercise. This is a business exercise. So we want to focus on those individuals that will have a role to play during the emergency or during the event. We want to make sure we've accounted for different sectors: human resources, public relations, physical security, personnel, line managers, anyone who would have an essential function to play in keeping the business up and running during the disaster. And the cloud is in scope. The cloud can go away. The cloud just went away. Did you have a plan for it? Technology fails. Plan for the failure of that tech. Backups are the #1 way to address a technology or to address this risk. Now, that backup might be a data backup. It might be a secondary computer that acts as a backup in the event that I need it. It might be I've cross-trained my fellow employee to execute my job function in my absence. So backups are the #1 way to address the risk of any kind of technology failure. The business continuity plan should account for redundancy. You notice I'm beating this drum very hard. I've seen too many people fail to account for this. They don't think about, Yeah, I've got a backup, so I'm okay. Okay, well, where are you going to run that backup from? So make sure you have redundancy. You should have multiple locations for backups, whether though, again, it's a data backup or whether it's that physical piece, having multiple locations ensures they're available. You need to account for external disasters as well. Your ISP goes down, your bank goes down, your SaaS provider, you can lose these services. And if you don't have redundancy built in, somebody else's external disaster could wind up being the thing that brings your business down. And again, test and update. Humans. I love humans. I love all the humans. That's why I'm here tonight talking to all of you guys and gals and people and folks from all over the world. Humans are the biggest part of information security. And I don't mean that in the let's blame the user way. I mean that in humans are our greatest ally and our greatest risk. And we'll talk more about that later, but they are the biggest part of information security. Technology alone cannot solve this problem. So we need to have clearly defined roles and job descriptions. Folks need to know what they're responsible for. It helps us to simplify security. We need processes and procedures for verifying their background, right? So when we're hiring folks and we're screening candidates and going through the hiring process, we're looking at their education, their work history, criminal record background check. We're looking at all these things. One thing we're not looking at today that I think we should is how security aware are they? I think that should be part of the hiring process, but that's just me. But we need to look at those things and we need to do it at a detail level that matches the position they have in the organization. So if I'm hiring a chief financial officer, I am going to do a much more robust background check into that individual than I might say the lawn care team, right? I might have the buildings and grounds gardening team, they need a background check, but maybe not as extensive as say a CFO. So make sure that the position has a background check. And if it is a sensitive position, that you go a little bit deeper. Be very clear about your policies around the use of social media and business systems. All too often, businesses get themselves into trouble. Bad guys gain necessary information to execute an attack because of the use of social media by employees, whether that is personal social media use or business social media use. So make sure that you have an appropriate use policy that addresses that. Please verify before granting access. Don't give them access to the system before the background check has come back. I know sometimes, especially right now, we're desperate to hire folks and we want to move quick, but make sure we're verifying before granting any access. Now, a lot of times employees are going to have different agreements and policies and stipulations that they have to abide by. The most common set are going to be a non-disclosure agreement, non-compete, may or may not be enforceable depending on where you are. Code of conduct, how do we expect you to behave with your coworkers and in the workplace and with customers and so on. Conflict of interest, that's another important one. Is there anything that you're doing that might represent a conflict of interest to the business that we need to be concerned about? Acceptable use, again, driving that point home, it's very important. Any standard employment policies, this is going to cover things like, vacation and maternity and expected work output and things like that. Policies or agreements around the use of equipment, what is okay and not okay. At Security Studio, business equipment is for business purposes. We don't let our children play video games on our work computer. That's an equipment use agreement that we have in place, right? Set those at-home expectations. This is a relatively new one, but unbelievably important. When you're doing remote work, which a lot of us are now, what are those at-home expectations for security? A cat walking across your keyboard could cause your data breach. So lock your workstation when you're at home. Crazy thought, right? I'm at home. Why would I lock my keyboard when I walk away? Well, I happen to own a cat that likes to jump up on things. So I'm gonna lock my keyboard to make sure they don't accidentally send some crazy email. As we navigate through our employment life, we have different stages. We join the organization, and then a lot of times, if we're there long enough, we're gonna move on. We're going to transfer into another role. And at some point, we're going to leave that organization, either voluntarily or involuntarily, depending on how we've done. But each stage of employment comes with a security component. So the better that we onboard, That's our chance. That's our chance to set tone from day one about what is appropriate work behavior, appropriate security behavior, appropriate use of technology. What is that, right? So that's our chance to really set that. We need a process for how we're going to train on secure habits. What is security awareness and how are we connecting with our humans? I prefer that I train my humans to have security care versus be security aware, but another slide deck for another day. We want to provide additional training to those high value targets, C-levels, administrative assistants of C-levels, folks with elevated permissions, our IT directors, these types of individuals who are more likely to be directly targeted with a sophisticated type of attack. We want additional training. Super, super, super important in my opinion. Number one actually is, how do I report a security incident? And is everyone in my organization aware of how to do that? I can't stress that one enough. The difference between a security incident or event and a full-blown disaster a lot of times comes down to how soon the security team learns that something is wrong. And generally that's going to be the employee reporting it. So having good reporting processes is super critical. We need to be clear on roles and responsibilities for securing the work area, whether that work area is at home, in the office, at the hotel. What are those habits and expectations? We need a process for how we're going to do data classification, and more importantly, how we're training our staff to know how to classify. When are they handling sensitive data, and are they handling it in a secure fashion? We need to make everyone aware that we do monitor things. This is not your computer. This is the business's computer. And yes, we are going to keep an eye on it. This is actually a bit of what we would call a deterrent control. The idea is if folks know that you're watching them, they're less likely to do something bad. I think that's a bit of a negative assumption, but also that's just the way it is. So make sure that folks are aware they're being monitored. This can also prevent any kind of privacy concerns or other issues later on with the employee, should you discover something and then use that monitoring as part of a corrective exercise with human resources or as part of a termination. Make sure they're very clear that their actions matter and make all the difference, both good and bad. The more the employee understands that they play a critical role, not just don't click a link, but a true defender, a true participant in the security of the organization, the less likely you are to have events. Now, this is a fun one, is when folks transfer jobs. So in my career, I would move from job to job to job, and the permissions I had from the previous system would follow me. And I would, by the time I left the company, I had admin on everything under the sun. Well, that's terrible security, very convenient for me. I could get in, I could do whatever I wanted, but bad practice. So make sure there's a clean and clear process for how role transfers are going to happen. Make sure that that's an opportunity to do an employee access review. So is the current access you have needed for your new role? Is there new access needed? A lot of times when we're doing role transfers, especially internally, there's going to be that transition period where, for the next 3 weeks, if the new person needs it, I'm going to step in and help them out. So I might retain my access for those couple of weeks, make sure that's clearly defined, as well as a cutoff time to either terminate that access or review the validity of that access. Enforced least privilege, only give people what they need, not anything more. And people need a lot less than they think they do, but make sure you're enforcing that. Address any legacy needs. This is especially true in smaller organizations. There can be that overlap. And there's a lot of creative ways to manage that, where it's a one-time access or a temporary access, and to help out with the legacy need without it being a full level of access. So terminations come in two forms: voluntary and involuntary. Voluntary is almost always a planned event, 2-week notice, retire. It's going to be a good terms type of departure. We're going to want to use our standard checklist. We're going to make sure we've recovered our equipment, we've recovered any disabled any access, recaptured keys, badges, and changed any access codes that they may have had. Involuntary separation is almost always an unplanned event. And in this time, you must assume threat. I hate to say that it's doomy and gloomy, but it's true. So when people get fired, they get excited. They get really excited, and usually not in a good way. So we have to assume threat. We have to assume that they're going to try to retaliate or do something. You know, they're generally going to be very emotional and not thinking clear. We have to respect the fact that it's also emotional for the other people in the org too. You know, that might be somebody's really, really good friend. You might be the person disabling the access for them, and they might be your good friend. So respecting the fact that it is an emotional event for everyone involved, and planning for that and respecting that, very important. Do your best to try to recover any equipment. You may want to retain that for potential forensics, depending on the nature of the involuntary separation. We need to notify, the remaining staff of the termination. We've had a couple of instances where someone was terminated in the morning, and mid-afternoon they're knocking on the back door, and because the staff didn't know they were terminated, they just opened the door and let them in. So we got to make sure we let folks know that. We need to have a process in place for reporting any attempted access by that terminated employee. And again, this is a health, life, and safety issue more than it's an IT issue. You know, we've seen too many times where termination results in someone coming back with a gun. So we want to make sure that we have processes in place for that. And then, little asterisks here about insider threat program. If you can do it, great. User entity behavior analytics, or UBA or UBA, however you want to pronounce it, can potentially indicate that somebody's maybe getting ready to do a rage quit. I think it's a little pseudoscience, but that's just me. But you should have some type of insider threat program. Another big area that's important is vendors, consultants, contractors, and their agreements and the controls around those agreements. We want to make sure we've got NDAs in place to protect our sensitive information from a legal perspective. We want to have policies in place that are going to allow us to monitor and audit access by third parties. You don't just get access to my server and I have no visibility into when and why you're accessing it. We want to have policies that require secure connections with third parties who are accessing sensitive data. So they should be coming in on a VPN, ideally one that we control. We want to, make sure that we're doing everything we can to limit that risk to them having that access. We want to have policy requirements for compliance, that all of their employees, the vendors' employees, the consultants, and the contractors are also receiving training and are retrained on the policies and regulations that they need to comply with in the fulfillment of their job duties. This is the policies and regulations of their employer as well as you and your company. What are your policies that they need to comply with? What are the regulations that you're held to that they need to be aware of and compliant with? We want to make sure we've covered privacy policies. What kind of personal data is being collected? How is it used, not used? How is it stored, maintained, and secured? Again, if we're working with a third party, our customer may ask us how we're doing in enforcing these things, and we need to have those answers from any vendor that we're doing business with. We want to make sure that these things are signed off. Signature is a very powerful thing. It is taking ownership of a particular thing. So with that, let's do another dad joke. What's the best way to catch a runaway robot? Use a botnet. Ha 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 ha. All right. Quick sip of water, and then let's get into the meat and potatoes of what we're really going to cover tonight, which is all about risk. So risk is anything that exposes something or someone to danger, harm, or loss. And we'll talk a little bit more in a moment, but I want you to see this diagram, because risk management is what's going to give us the structure for making security decisions. Every security decision we're going to make should be based in a risk approach. How risky is it? Is it worth dealing with? Do I need to spend more, spend less, whether that's time or dollars? Risk is going to give us that. And risk is the intersection of a threat, a vulnerability, and an asset. So that's where risk lives, is in the center of this Venn diagram. Information security is risk management. That is what this is, period. Hard stop. Lock that away. So again, risk, anything that exposes someone or something of value to danger, harm, or loss. Inherent risk is the risk that is present before any security controls are applied. Residual risk is the level of risk that remains after controls are applied. There is no risk elimination. There's a saying in IT that the only secure computer is one that's buried in concrete and dropped at the bottom of the Marianas Trench. And even then I have my doubts, right? So there's always going to be that residual risk, no risk elimination. So understanding these concepts is very important because you will interact with that quite often. Threats are going to be any negative event that leads to a negative outcome. So fire, natural disaster are like some very common types of threats. Disgruntled employees can definitely be a threat. Cyber criminals trying to extort you and ransom you can be a threat. Click happy employees, also very much a threat. Threats, again, are that negative event leading to a negative outcome. A threat in and of itself isn't necessarily a risk. A vulnerability isn't necessarily a risk by itself. And we'll talk a little bit more about how those intersect to turn into a risk, but threats are any kind of negative event to a negative outcome. A vulnerability is going to be any weakness or gap in the system that could be exploited. And traditionally, when we talk about vulnerabilities, we talk about technical, right? So unpatched software, unupdated systems. But it could be weak access control mechanisms. And in this example, passwords, but it could also be a door that's propped open. It could be that somebody's overly tired, working a double shift, right? That employee could be vulnerable or more susceptible to, say, a social engineering attack, right? So vulnerability is simply that weakness or gap in a system that may be exploited. Vulnerabilities can come and go. Vulnerabilities can increase or decrease in how likely they are to occur, but they're going to be there. These are the most common ones. Really, it comes down to that security unaware employee, those unpatched software apps. My gosh, it's those are like number one and number two. So know that and keep your eye out for that. Assets. Assets are anything of value. Okay. A value can be quantitative. So that's, cost, the actual financial cost or market value of the asset. Value can also be qualitative. So what is the relative importance to you or the organization? I have things that I own that are financially really worth nothing, but qualitatively to me, they hold significant importance. So I place very high value on them, even though financially they may not be worth anything. And transversely, I have things that are financially worth money that I don't really care what happens to it. So it's understanding the value. And why this is important is that when we're talking to the business about what matters, when we're talking about the value of an asset, we need to look at both, not just the financial impact, but what is the relative importance? How difficult would it be if something happened to it? Is it, going to bring doom and gloom and dark clouds if it's gone for a day? Or is it no big deal, right? So understanding what that value is, qualitative versus qualitative, super important to know. Here's an example. What's an asset? It's hardware, it's software, it's IoT, it's cloud, it's data, it's third parties, it's people, it's anything that the business has placed value on. A little more rocket fuel and we keep going. So once we've understood what a threat is and a vulnerability is, now it's time to identify them. How are we going to identify them? And we're going to do that by conducting a risk assessment. I like to say that risk assessments are the gateway to good security. If you are trying to do security and you do not have a risk assessment, I'm not entirely sure what you're securing against, right? I can add a firewall, but again, if I'm not aware of the risk that's helping me to mitigate or the value of the asset I'm protecting, I may or may not be making the best choice. So risk assessments follow a pretty specific path. It starts with identifying what those risks are first, and then doing an analysis of those risks. Okay, so just because a risk exists doesn't necessarily mean we're going to do anything. So we have to do an analysis to understand what is that risk and start to put some context around it. And then we take another deeper look and we actually evaluate the risk. And this is where we start getting into things like, the likelihood and the impact. And we'll go to get into that in just a second. But then once we've evaluated the risk, then if we're going to do something about it, we apply a risk treatment. All risks get a risk treatment, even if that treatment is accept the risk. And we'll talk more here in just a moment about kind of risk assessments and how we go through this process. There are different types of risks. And again, a reminder, no such thing as risk elimination. Now, selfishly, I wanted to show you what we do. Security Studio provides risk assessments. It's our bread and butter. It's what we do. And the way that we put risk into context is by using our S2 score. So this is a way to look at risk in a business context to help folks make those risk decisions. And behind the curtain, there's lots of little details that help us, map and manage what those risks are. So as we go through that process, we start with risk identification. Generally, it's going to be an asset discovery. What the heck do I have? We talk a lot about asset inventory. Well, the inventory starts with discovery. So what hardware do I have? What software? What networks? What data? What people? What filing cabinet full of paper? What do I have? Where is it? Okay. We want to then understand what the value of that asset is to the business. So we found the asset. Now, what's its valuation? And again, back to that qualitative and quantitative, true value to the business. How important is it? This is going to inform us on how much effort we would put into protecting it. We want to classify it. How sensitive is it? How critical is it? The TV screen in the cafeteria that shows the lunch menu may not be the most sensitive equipment in the building, but the computer that controls the door locks to the building, well, that's probably fairly sensitive. The system that runs the core enterprise resource planning software of the business, probably pretty critical. So we want to classify that. And classification also helps us, again, make sure that we're making good risk decisions. We're spending our information security dollars wisely, and that we know what level of security control and monitoring we want to have in place. So classification, very important. And then after we've gone through that, we want to look at what the vulnerabilities and threats are to that specific asset. Again, this is going to inform us on what we would do to address or treat that risk. Risk analysis generally is going to begin with a vulnerability assessment. This is what the book tells you. Again, this is more technical in nature. I like to take a more holistic approach, but absolutely you should be understanding what those vulnerabilities are from a technical and non-technical perspective. We'll get more into that in detail in chapter 6, and we'll go a little deeper in threat analysis yet tonight. The goal of risk analysis is, again, to identify how likely are the identified threats to exploit the weakness, to exploit the vulnerability. So if I have a risk and I have a vulnerability, now I need to understand how likely that event is to occur. And if that event occurs, what's the impact? So we got to look at those two key factors. We have to look at the likelihood. What is the probability that the event will occur? And then if it does occur, how disastrous is it going to be? So risk is threat times vulnerability, or likelihood and impact. Or another way to look at it is risk is threat times vulnerability times impact. Either way you go, a risk is not fully realized until the threat and vulnerability, the likelihood and impact, are understood. This also informs us on what we're going to spend, what we're going to do, how aggressively we would monitor it, all the different security elements that would go into addressing that risk are going to be driven by its likelihood and impact. Human life trumps everything. You cannot stress that enough. That's so important, especially in our digital world now, where digital events have direct physical impacts. So make sure we're looking at that. As we go through the risk analysis, we want to be, looking at it from a qualitative and quantitative perspective. So qualitative is what I like to refer to as the licking of the thumb, right? In my professional opinion, I feel like it's a high or a medium or a low. And there's nothing wrong with that. Definitely professional opinions count, but it's not measurable. It is interpretive, it is subjective. Quantitative is going to be objective. That is based on hard numbers, hard dollars, hard facts. It is, you know, it's measurable. It's actionable. I can do math against it. A quantitative analysis is really qualitative analysis is pretty much impossible due to lack of data. So we take those two elements and we throw them into a risk analysis matrix. So a way to look at risk is in this matrix. So on the left vertice, we have, what is the probability? And then below we have, what is the impact? I spend the majority of my risk decision making in this upper right quadrant. Generally, I'm not paying any attention to anything in the green. Yellow, I maybe am aware of, probably not. I'm not getting out of bed for a medium because I have enough high and very high to occupy my day. So, when we're thinking about putting that risk into context, again, we want to use measurable things that allow us to get to something like this. If we were to try to be subjective and use a diagram like this, well, is your very high the same as my very high? Probably not. So, the more we can use those kind of direct, metric and measure based methods for evaluating the risk analysis, the better off we're going to be. So again, beating this drum again, quantitative versus qualitative. What is the asset value? What is the fair market value of a given asset? What is the exposure factor? So how much in a percentage of the asset loss are we going to experience during an incident or threat occurrence? So, do we lose all of it, some of it? How much of that service, of that asset is going to be lost? What's our exposure factor? We're going to have single loss expectancy. So this is going to be the asset value times the exposure factor. This is a one-time loss. That we want to account for that. This can happen, say we've got a hard drive failure, right? If you've got a SAN and it's full of hard drives, it's sooner in spinning disk or non-spinning disk, but at some point, one of them is going to die, and that's a single loss expectancy, right? So I account for that. I have math around that. Annual rate of occurrence. So how many times a year is a bad thing expected to happen? This could be, maybe you live in an area where power is not fully stable, and so you have a certain number of power losses that could occur within a given year. Or you could, some companies are starting to plan their ransomware around this, which is crazy, but it's happening. But it's how many times a bad thing can be expected to happen. And then the annualized loss expectancy. So again, this is this kind of year over year thing. So that's going to be your single loss expectancy times the annual rate of occurrence. If the annualized loss expectancy exceeds the total cost of ownership, then there is a positive return on investment or a return on security investment. Memorize this stuff. You need to know it. This is the math that you're most likely going to use when you're making your budgets and doing your risk decisions on spend. So driving the point home one more time, risk is the likelihood of something bad happening and the impact if it did. Annualized loss expectancy is the cost of a loss due to a risk over a year. Safeguard, control, countermeasure. We have all kinds of lovely names for this, but it's any measure taken to reduce the risk. And then total cost of ownership is the total cost of that safeguard, that security control, that countermeasure. And then what was our return on investment? How much money did we save by addressing the risk with a countermeasure, control, or safeguard versus doing nothing and just allowing the disaster to happen? So the more that we can position these things as returns on security investments, the more the business is going to understand the value of what we're doing here. So it's important to understand this stuff. Please do memorize it. And send me baby Yodas, because acronym soup. Get used to it. The acronyms are just going to keep coming. Memorize them as best as you can. I'll be honest, some of these come and go, but you should know them for the exam. They are testable. All right, risk tolerance. So how much risk is the organization willing to take on? This is could be a broad amount of variability here. What risk tolerance you're willing to put up with is not necessarily equal to the next person, is not one business to the next business, but it's what's that maximum amount of risk that they're willing to take on before they are becoming uncomfortable. The risk profile is, again, because we need 5 ways to describe one thing, how much risk is the organization willing to take on, right? That's the bottom line. What's that maximum amount of risk that we're comfortable with? Then once we have those risks, we apply risk treatments or risk responses. So again, 2 ways to say the same thing. And what we're saying here is, what is the best way to address the risk? And best way meaning financially sound, technically implementable, enforceable, effective, auditable, right? And we need all those things to be true in order for it to be the best way to address the risk. And not every risk that you address has a technical solution. Matter of fact, a lot of times it's a non-technical solution. And to Ron's point in the chat there, best way is absolutely a question for the lawyer. I am not a lawyer. None of this is legal advice. Now, when it comes to risk response and risk treatment, there are 4 criteria and only 4 criteria. Make sure everything is documented. You, as a security practitioner, a CISSP, a CISO, whatever your role may be in information security, do not make risk decisions. It's not your decision to make. There are a lot of CISOs out there that don't know that. It is a business decision, and it should be made by the business, by the most senior leadership of the business, never information security professionals. Risk appetite is the same as risk tolerance. Yes. Thank you, Caroline. That's another way to say it, right? And get comfortable with that there's like 50, 60 different ways to say any one thing in this business, but memorize the stuff on the slides and in the book, because that's what you're going to be tested on. So the 4 treatments are accept. Do I accept the risk? I'm not going to do anything about it. I'm good with that. I ate the Taco Bell. I've accepted the risk. Am I going to mitigate the risk? It's unacceptable. It's too high and it requires remediation. I ate the Taco Bell, but now I need some Pepto-Bismol because the risk is unacceptable to me. Okay. Can I transfer the risk? Can I make this somebody else's problem? Pass it off to a third party, pass it off to my insurance, blame the cloud, right? Can I transfer the risk? Can I avoid it? Is there something I can do to stop, to discontinue, to, get rid of that Windows XP box that's wide open on the internet, right? Can I avoid the risk in the first place? There are 4 and only 4: accept, mitigate, transfer, avoid. Most of us live in mitigation. And risk mitigation is going to involve 1 or more countermeasure. Countermeasure, security control, safeguard. I'm going to stick with countermeasures from this point forward because that's what's in the book. And I want to make sure that, what you're getting out of this is consistent with the book, but 1 or more countermeasures with the end goal being reducing the likelihood. So how can I bring that likelihood down, right? And a reminder, likelihood is how likely is there to be a negative event or an adverse event. So we're gonna look at some standard common countermeasures: personnel, hiring, roles, awareness training, employee policy, clarity with the user on actions, activities, things they need to do, right? So number 1, people are our greatest security risk. Number 2, they are our greatest security control. know that, work with them. I can't stress this enough. And if you follow me on anything else, you'll see that reaching the human and getting them to participate and care and be an active defender is really my core passion. So people are number one, bottom line. So let's make sure we've addressed those personal related countermeasures. We want process related countermeasures, policies, procedures, workflow based type controls, separation of duty, dual control. I'll give you a quick example of a process related control. There is a common scam going around for direct deposit redirect. So the HR department gets an email from an employee, says, hey, I just switched my banks. Here's my new bank account number. Will you make that change? If they don't have a process related countermeasure in place, then they make the change. Payday comes. The employee says, I didn't get paid. They say, yeah, we paid you to your new bank. If they had a process related control that required verification, in this case, dual control, I went to the employee and I verified that they actually wanted to make that change. I've now put a countermeasure in place to prevent that particular type of attack or scam. Technology related, again, this is where all the attention's been applied over the years, encryption, configuration settings, hardware, software, change detection. Well, you can't throw encryption at availability and expect it to be a countermeasure. So, technology related countermeasures are great, but there are things that they will not address. There are other types of technology related countermeasures that may not apply to certain areas. So making sure that we select the appropriate countermeasure for the risk we are attempting to mitigate is absolutely critical. So some personnel security considerations, because information security is not about information or security, believe it or not. It's all about people. It really is. It's so much about the people. So awareness and training are not the same thing. They are two very different things. Training is going to give you a specific set of skills. Awareness is around activities, reminders, am I aware? And if I was to add a third bullet point, it would be care. How do we get them to care? I'm aware of a lot of things that I frankly don't care about. And most of our users are in a same or similar situation. Background checks. Who am I bringing into my organization? What do I know about them? How able are they to effectively execute their roles, their responsibilities? If it's a high sensitivity role, I might want to recheck. I might have to check in with them, right? I might, finance people, a good example, a good friend of mine works for an institution that handles a lot of money that's not a bank. And they had an employee that they suspected maybe was getting into some outside of marital things, and they were considering them to be at high risk for blackmail. And so they had to hire a private investigator and dig into that because it was presenting a risk. So make sure that we're being very thorough, and the higher the sensitivity of the role, the more thorough we should be. Be very clear about how you handle termination and discipline. With the rise in cyber criminals going to Glassdoor and looking for disgruntled employees and trying to get them to sell their credentials and other things, with some of the social motivations that we're seeing around maybe some different ways of handling the pandemic or other cultural elements, really understanding how that works, putting processes in place, being formalized in how we do our discipline, being prepared that when we do discipline, that we might be increasing our risk with that individual. So make sure you have that. Make sure you're doing exit interviews, rights revocations, that you're reviewing accounts. One thing that often gets overlooked is what system accounts did that employee have access to? So while you've disabled their accounts, are there any system accounts that maybe they had credentials for that might also need to be updated? Make sure you've got good process around dealing with the vendors, contractors, and third parties, and how you're going to do outsourcing and offshoring. If people didn't suffer, we wouldn't care. And people are the most significant risk. And again, they're also your most significant ally in the fight if you engage them the right way. All right, so let's talk a bit about security effectiveness. I can have all the security in the world, but if it's not effective, it's pretty much useless to me. So we want to make sure that any controls that we're selecting address the specific risk that we're trying to put a control around or mitigate, and that the controls we've selected are in line with the type of risk we're addressing. So is it a prevent type of control, a detect, or a correct? So we want to make sure that the controls we've selected are addressing that risk and are also addressing it in the way that we want, in line with that risk: prevent, detect, or correct. And then we've got to be cost effective. At the end of the day, if the security control costs more than the asset value, that's just not a good approach. It's not going to work. You're not going to get approved to spend the money. So make sure you're doing that cost benefit analysis. How much is this countermeasure going to cost us? And is that less than the cost that would be realized if a compromise of a risk or the countermeasures that we had was actualized? So if somebody attacks the machine and we get ransomed, was the cost of the countermeasure less than the cost of the ransom? So another way to look at this is, if the annual loss expectancy from the event is 200,000, and I've implemented a countermeasure of a backup for 50,000, I've actually added back value to the organization of $150,000. Now, another key point here that often goes overlooked is that countermeasures have ongoing cost to factor. There could be licensing costs. There could be support and maintenance costs. You could have to hire staff to run that countermeasure. So make sure that when you're doing this cost benefit analysis, you are factoring the total cost of ownership over time, right? Make sure that you understand that, yeah, I got a discount to buy it, but next year I'm paying full price, or I now have to do this big implementation project for this much money. Make sure you factored that in. Countermeasures need to be evaluated for the impact to the organization. While I would like to interrogate every single packet of network traffic, if I was to do that to the most stringent standards, no one would be able to get to the internet. So we have to understand that the countermeasure may have an impact beyond just technology, right? Might impact the organization. We can't have countermeasures that are too difficult to implement or use, or are too cumbersome. If the control is too hard to work with, people will work around it. Humans will circumvent any difficult countermeasures. I've seen places where they have very stringent data sharing countermeasures, and they're very difficult to work with. And most of the employees had a private Dropbox set up to work around that. So make sure that countermeasure isn't actually increasing risk because it is not a good fit or has not yet been evaluated for the impact to the organization. Understanding culture and strategy is super important. So the culture of the business you're in, the strategy of the business that you're in, is very important to selecting appropriate countermeasures that won't have a negative operational impact. Culture and strategy alignment are a countermeasure's best friend. So the more that your countermeasure is aligned to culture, aligned to strategy, and is supporting of those things, the higher the likelihood that it's going to be highly effective and adopted, broadly. If there's too much misalignment, again, folks are going to work around it. They're going to find creative ways to not interact with that countermeasure, or you're going to end up with a boss coming down the hall saying, you've got to turn it off. You're stopping the business. We can't make the sale. My team can't do their job. And so that event might set you back a few months, right? You worked really hard to get this countermeasure in, and then you got to turn it off because it doesn't fit the business. That almost always happens if you didn't take time to evaluate it for the impact that it would have to the organization. Okay, a little more energy drink here and a breath, and then we'll get into the different types of controls. Feel free to put in the chat if I'm moving at a good pace for you guys, if you're finding this helpful. Feedback is always appreciated. All right. So controls are going to fall into one of three categories. They're either going to be administrative in nature, technical in nature, or physical in nature. And then within those categories, we have different types. Now, the book didn't actually cover, at least in the section I was in, the categories. And so I included that because I think it's very important to understand that. It is very testable. The types are very testable. The categories also very testable, or at least they were. Preventative. Okay, so preventative controls are going to be kind of where we start with this. It's your first line control. It is the firewall. It's the validation. It's the training. It's my first line of defense. I'm trying to prevent the risk from happening to begin with, right? Can I do it? I think of smoke detectors. You know, that's a preventative. It's no, the smoke detector is a detective. Sorry, preventative would be not letting people play with matches in the office, right? It's a preventative control. Please don't play with the fire. Detective is going to be identifying that negative security event. So that smoke alarm, that building alarm, the intrusion detection system, any audits that I might be conducting, right? Things that are going to allow me to say, wait, something's not quite right. Preventative physical controls, door locks and things, and detective, alarms. So preventative, again, trying to keep it from happening. Detective, discovering it when it did. And then corrective. Corrective control is about minimizing and repairing the damage. Okay, so the bad thing's already happened. I couldn't prevent it. Maybe I detected it. And now I'm going to take that corrective action. A lot of times that's going to be, patching, config management, reconfiguring the firewall to not have any policy on the outbound. I'm going to maybe make a new policy. Or I'm going to update an existing policy. So going back to not every type of security control or countermeasure is necessarily a technology-based measure. You can also have control types that are multiple types, right? You can have a control that is preventative, detective, and corrective. Not going to go too deep on that, but that can also be true. And then recovery. That's how am I getting back to my normal as soon as possible? Traditionally, this is going to be our backups, our disaster recovery plans. The goal of a recovery control, again, is I want to be back to normal. I want to get back to my baselines. Deterrent, generally going to be policy or physical. It's discourage, in the physical world, dogs, guard dogs, that's a deterrent. Security guards with guns and towers and bright lights, that's a deterrent. Police officers patrolling, that's a deterrent, right? It's a discourage type of event. When it comes to business settings, that acceptable use policy that is enforceable with things like discipline and termination, that's going to be a deterrent control. It's also going to be a preventative control, right? We're trying to prevent the problem from happening by telling you, here's how to use the systems acceptably. But it's also a deterrent control because if you don't, well, then there's consequences. So it acts as both a preventative and a deterrent. Now, again, another one that's not in the book, clearly called out, but is very important, is compensating controls. Again, reality, my gosh, compensating controls are some of the most common ones you're going to find. It's put in place to satisfy a security requirement that has been deemed too difficult, too impractical to implement, right? Like, you want me to do what? Oh, I'm not doing that. MFA, right? I joke about this because working with K-12, you would think that multi-factor authentication was the most insane thing ever in the world to implement. And it is too difficult. It is too impractical to implement at the present time. So what do we do then? Well, we compensate for that. We don't fully mitigate the risk. We generally will take an encourage versus enforce approach. So, hey, if you could not click the link, that'd be great, right? That's a compensating control. Get comfortable with compensating controls. Again, you're going to run into it all the time. Every security situation I've been in where we've been going through designing controls or reviewing controls, there's always that thing where, yeah, it'd be great if we could, but we can't. And then the conversation shifts to, all right, well, if we can't do that, what can we do? How far can we get towards mitigation, knowing, and I'm going to go back to an old term we just learned, how much residual risk is my risk appetite or risk tolerance comfortable with, and have I done enough compensating control to address that, but not necessarily fully mitigate it. All right, another dumb dad joke. So we all know about Murphy's Law, or at least I hope we all do. And Murphy's Law is that anything that can go wrong will go wrong. But have you heard of Cole's Law? It's thinly sliced cabbage. Oh yeah, I searched the internet hard for that one. All right. Let's see, where are we at? Okay, well, we're doing okay on time. Control assessments. So control assessments are going to be the assessment we conduct against the security controls, security countermeasures. What we're doing here is we're taking a look at the assessment objects. We're taking it apart. We're trying to understand if the thing we think is doing what we want it to is actually doing it. So the examine piece is that we inspect, we review, study, analyze the assessment objects. Here, what we're looking at are the specific specifications, mechanisms, or activities, right? What is going on? What are we doing? What are the bounds of those things that we need to account for? We're going to interview folks. We're going to talk to them. We're going to gain clarity. We're going to get confirmation of evidence that they may have provided during the exam phase. So, we're going through and we're saying, okay, what do we have? They say, well, we've got this data loss prevention solution. Okay, what are the specifications of that? Well, it works like this. Okay, what are the supporting activities for ensuring that control is effective? It looks like this. And then we're going to sit down, we're going to interview those folks to get that clarity and make sure that what we've been provided is consistent with what the people who are actually responsible for it believe to be true. We're going to test these things. So we're actually going to test the security controls, and we're going to see if the actual behavior of the control matches the expected behavior. It should work like that. Now compared against it does work like that. And there's been many times in my career where the actual control performed outside of the expected behavior. We thought it was logging the file, but it wasn't. We thought it was blocking the traffic, but it wasn't. So testing is critical to this because what we've documented needs to match what's actually implemented. What we think is happening needs to match what is actually happening. And we need to prove that things are operating effectively and as intended. This is an auditor's bread and butter. Show me the evidence. Can I get a copy of the change record to compare? Because you said you do change control. Your policy says you do change control. And now I want a piece of evidence to support that you're doing change control. And then I want to watch you execute a change so that I can prove that what you said is true, what's documented matches reality, and that you're actually adhering to what you said you're adhering to. The other thing here is we're going to monitor and measure. So we need to keep an eye on our security controls for effectiveness and health. I won't name the product, but there's just got an alert today that a very well-known network inspection tool, an IDS tool, now has a exploitable vulnerability that allows the cyber actors or cyber attackers to make the tool look like it's doing its job while circumventing it. So the measuring of these things, the checking in on these things. Now, ideally, you should be monitoring this in an ongoing fashion. That's what is best practice. That's what's coming to your doorstep soon as the world continues to evolve. The book will tell you that it should be annual or quarterly. But I promise you, if you're only checking in on your security controls once a quarter or once a year, the bad guys are checking on them once a minute. So keep that in mind. Monitor and measure. It's important to report out on all this stuff. Data is great. Data helps us. Love data. But without being able to report on that data and help stakeholders, regulators, and others that need to know what's going on have that visibility, is kind of pointless. So make sure that we've got some kind of formal process in place to report to leadership and others any important discoveries or metrics. Now, I like how they phrased important discoveries. Important discovery. Turns out our domain admin password is on the darknet for sale. That's an important discovery. Turns out that the firewall's not configured the way we thought it was. An important discovery. So make sure that you've got a process to do that notification. This is one where I'm going to say invoke lawyer. Make sure that the lawyer also is involved, because there are certain things that you may have to report to regulators or others that will go deeper beyond just the data that you have. So make sure folks are working with you. Another really important one to understand is there is a new reporting requirement. If you are critical infrastructure in the United States of America, or you are a covered entity who is providing service or product to critical infrastructure, you have to report to Homeland Security within 72 hours of having a confirmed security event. And you have to report to the Department of Homeland Security within 24 hours of paying any ransom payment. So making sure that you've got an understanding of what needs to be in that report, who's going to gather it, how it's going to be gathered, what are those requirements, critically important to make sure that you are compliant with that law and not finding yourself getting in trouble. There could be other specific requirements around different legal regulations that you are beholden to, different regulatory regulations, industry specific. Just know that, memorize that, and learn that for your specific industry. A well-managed risk-based program, common areas of reporting are going to be the internal audits. These are self-assessments, how are we doing, or at least how do we think we're doing? External audits, brought in an outside third-party security firm, maybe the regulators, want to see things. So having that reporting, any significant change to the organization's risk posture, any significant change to the organization's security or privacy controls, and any suspected or confirmed security incidents or breaches. This is kind of base table stakes. So I threw this together. This is also not in the book, but I think it's really important. Back to, part of what we want to do in all of this is strive to improve the efficiency of the security program and improve the ROI that's associated with security investments. Using maturity modeling to assess the strength of our security program and to inform any plans we have for continuous improvement is a great way to do it. Using any kind of predefined scale. You can see I gave, the S2 score a plug there, but really any predefined scale will do. And it's going to help you focus on the specific behaviors to improve. All too often we get down in the weeds of a specific security gap. I need encryption on everything. Okay, but what risk are you mitigating? And is that truly going to move the needle for you? Or is it maybe let's focus on better training around how to share sensitive data so that we're at lower risk of accidental data exposure? So that's where the scale comes in. Not enough security, too much risk, being weighed against too much security and being burdensome or cumbersome to the business. So we have to strike that balance. And every day we should be looking for opportunities to strike that balance, to improve that efficiency, to improve the ROI, and make sure that the things we're doing fit and are effective and are enforceable. Nothing worse in the world than a bunch of money spent on a security program that didn't actually move the needle, when that effort and those resources could have been better applied to maybe more of a specific behavior that we were looking to change. Now we're going to get into risk frameworks. Oh, joy. This is the frameworks. And if you're not familiar with frameworks, well, you will be by the end of this course, I promise. So when we're looking at our frameworks, what we want to do here is we want to be consistent. We want to make sure that whatever we're doing the same way as much as possible. Consistency is key. Because if I have too much variability, it becomes hard to manage things cost effectively. Automation can become more challenging. Trying to figure out what's going on takes more time. So the more we can be consistent, the better. We want to make sure that whatever framework we're using is measurable. I want to be able to show progress. I want to be able to show goal completion, right? It's measurable. We need to be able to show that. We want to have it as standardized as possible. Every day somebody invents a new framework. Please stop. There's plenty. Just pick one, go with it. They basically all say the same stuff anyways. We want standardization for meaningful comparisons. How do I compare an apple to an apple if I have an apple and a bag of grapes? It's very hard. I can't make that comparison. So we want to be standardized, and we want to be comprehensive. We want to cover the minimum, but also be extensible, right? Because we need to pivot. We need to adjust. Things change. Risk evolves. We need to be able to evolve with it. We want to be modular whenever possible. This is, again, so we can withstand change, right? And we only want to modify what we need. I don't want to have to go back and revisit the entire program because of a single change. So we want to keep this in mind. We want to try to be consistent, measurable, standardized, comprehensive, and modular. So which framework do I choose? Throw some Dungeons and Dragons dice in a bag, shake it around and pour it out. They really are basically the same. However, there are a few nuances. So now we're going to go through some of the more common frameworks. And again, this is all in the book and it's testable. So that's why we're going through it today. So the International Standards Organization has a wide swath of frameworks for a variety of things, both inside of information security and outside of information security. In this particular example, we're going to look at the 31,000 2018. And within that, there are 8 principles. There, of course, like most frameworks, the ISO 31,000 by itself isn't actually implementable. So then you have to refer to another document known as the ISO 31004 for the guidance on how to actually implement the ISO 31,000 2018. The ISO 31,000 is a series of frameworks. There are several, and the 31,000 series really looks at generalized risk at kind of that higher level. When we start talking about information security practices, when we start getting into the specifics, we're going to be looking at the ISO 27,000 series. And that's where we get more into the specific guidance and practices that are directly relevant to information security practices. The ISO 27005 does not provide you a risk assessment practice. What the ISO 27005 does is provides you inputs to and outputs from the risk assessment practice that you chose to use. Myself, this is not among one of my favorites, and I think you can maybe see why. It's a lot, and most organizations need to get moving on something. This really is going to be for a much more mature organization, but anybody could do it. Here's another way to look at it. So the principles of the ISO 31,000 series is that it's customized, it's inclusive, it's comprehensive, it's integrated, it's dynamic, it's using the best available information, it's considering human and cultural factors, and it's structured for continual improvement. Now, again, back to that human component, human and culture plays a significant factor in how you approach risk, how you manage risk, and what frameworks truly fit your organization. And Ron does bring up a good point. ISO is a copywritten, pay to play. So unless you're already an ISO aligned organization, that may not be the one you want to go with. Excuse me. So I'll give you a second to look at this while I drink some water, and then we'll keep trucking forward. All right. So probably the most common one that is out there that I think is actually pretty effective and freely available to all is the U.S. National Institute of Standards and Technology's Risk Management Framework. Let's take a peek at that. So the DoD uses the Risk Management Framework. It is pretty straightforward. You're going to categorize the system, right? And we talked about that a little bit earlier on, right? And that category is going to help inform us on what security controls would be appropriate. Once we've selected the controls that we want to implement, we actually go through the process of implementing them. And boy, is that a big difference between going, I want to do it, and now I'm doing it. And if you've ever implemented security controls, you're probably sharing my pain right now. And for those of you that haven't, feel free to reach out to me on Twitter when you do and say, I totally know what you were talking about that night. Once you've put the controls in place, it's time to assess them. Are they working? Is just because I think I did it right, did I really do it right? Rich, to answer your question, best framework for K-12 is going to probably be the RMF, NIST CSF. Hit me up offline. I can point you in some good directions. All right. So once the security controls have been assessed, we're going to authorize the system. Notice that the system does not become authorized until we have completed our assessment of the security controls and confirm them to be in a known good working state. This is how we're managing that risk. We're preventing it. Once the system's authorized, then it becomes about monitoring. And then we use the outputs of that monitoring to inform our categorization. Just because we thought we categorized it right, we may or may not have, or maybe something changed, or maybe there's a new vulnerability present that's been introduced by a vendor, or a million other factors that cause us to want to go back and revisit. And as you notice, this is a life cycle circle, right? This should be a continuous process. Risk frameworks, COBIT and risk. COBIT is the control objectives for information and related technology. Comes out of the 90s from ISACA. Governance of enterprise IT has 5 processes. Management of IT has 32 processes. It is very closely aligned to the ISO 27001, ITIL, Prince2, SOX, and TOGAF. I'm not going to go too deep on that. If COBIT is something that's applicable to you, you can dig deeper, but we kind of glaze over it in the book. Risk IT is a kind of a sister component, if you will, to kind of COBIT. It's a separate assessment framework, but kind of you find them commonly in similar areas. Again, this is going to be about risk governance, risk evaluation, risk response. There are those 3 processes. It's going to identify organizational responsibilities, the information flows between processes, performance management activities, and like the ISO frameworks, you need a practitioner guide to actually implement this. Let's talk a little bit about threat modeling. So threat modeling is a technique used to identify the potential threats, okay? What is a threat? A threat is a vulnerability or absence of necessary security control. Our attack surface is the total area an attacker could execute a compromise. So how exposed is the thing to bad actors that want to attack it? Some examples would be access control systems, communications, any weakness in the software architecture. In the physical world, that's going to mean, entrances and exits to the building, building construction techniques. If the wall's made of paper mache, that makes for a pretty tasty attack surface. Physical location can also be a factor. So memorize these definitions. Know them. When we're talking about threat modeling, we're going to look here at the attacker-centric model. So an attacker-centric threat model is looking at the characteristics, skill sets, and motivations of a cyber criminal or a bad actor. And when I say bad actor, I'm not referring to Tom Cruise. But what we're looking at here is, what are those skill sets? What are those motivations? How capable and competent is that actor? We then are going to profile that attacker against specific attacks that they're most likely to try to execute. Generally, this is going to be part of our business continuity and disaster recovery planning process. And the whole goal of this is to understand how the attacker operates. And by gaining that understanding of how the attacker operates, we're more able to effectively monitor and put in the appropriate countermeasures to prevent that type of attack. A good example is anyone that's worked in the financial sector is familiar with the anti-money laundering process. So there are steps that one goes through to make sure that when you're doing financial transactions, that you have done enough due care and due diligence, and you've looked deeply enough at the people involved and the transaction that money laundering is not occurring. Same thing, attacker-centric. I'm looking out for the process behind money laundering activities, and I'm taking appropriate steps. Same thing here, attacker-centric. I'm looking at what are those characteristics, skill sets, and motivations, and have I done enough to account for it? Asset-centric is going to be focused on the asset value to the organization, but also the asset value to the attacker. So you might have an asset in your organization that financially and from a business process aren't worth much to the organization, but to the attacker, they're incredibly valuable. For example, if you have a legacy file share that half of IT forgot exists, and the person that built it retired 10 years ago, but it still has stored credentials for domain admin on it, it may be of no value to the business at this time. They've moved on to SharePoint Online or something like that, but to an attacker, that thing is incredibly valuable. So we need to understand both the organizational value, but also the value to the attacker. We want to understand how this asset is managed, manipulated, used, and stored. Manipulated in a positive way, not in a negative way. But what are we doing with the what are we doing with it, right? How are we interacting with it? What is it doing, and how are the data, the VMs, all the things associated with the asset, how are they stored? We want to identify and evaluate what an attacker might do to compromise the asset. Well, this is putting ourselves in the bad guy seat and thinking like the bad guy. How would I compromise that asset? What could I do? How could I do it? And then if we go back to that attacker-centric, what skill set might be required to do that? A lot of the compliance regimes, and I love that they call them regimes because that's kind of what they are, but many of the compliance regimes are going to focus on asset protection. So HIPAA, GDPR, PCI DSS, how am I protecting the PII, the PHI, the assets that the PHI and PII and cardholder data, reside on, going to be looking at it from that perspective. And taking an asset-centric approach can be helpful in protecting other assets such as intellectual property. Not every asset is a digital asset. So, we want to think about that and say, okay, well, I've got architectural, actual physical drawings, I need to protect those. So we're going to look at that from an asset-centric perspective. Software-centric or system-centric, this model is probably the most useful. Systems are represented as an asset of interconnected diagrams. Generally, this is going to be a data flow diagram or component diagram. We're going to look at those diagrams and we're going to try to evaluate them for potential attacks against each component. And then we're going to determine whether or not a security control is necessary, already exists, and if it does exist, does it achieve the desired control effect? Some different threat modeling frameworks, and I'm going to move through these pretty quickly because we are nearing time. Memorize this stuff, but STRIDE. STRIDE stands for spoofing, tampering, repudiation, information disclosure, denial of service, and elevation of privilege. So what we're looking for in STRIDE is we're looking for how likely is it to be spoofed, how easy is it to tamper with, could we repudiate if need be. Repudiation is saying, no, it wasn't me. And in the world of security, what we want is non-repudiation. Yes, it was you. Information disclosure, that one's pretty straightforward. Denial of service, it being unavailable for use, or any type of elevation of privilege if it was to be compromised. PASTA, process for attack simulation and threat analysis. So here we're going to define the objectives, the technical scope. We're going to do an application decomposition, insert $50 word. We're going to run a threat analysis. We're going to do a vulnerability analysis, attack enumerations, risk and impact analysis. I do encourage you to study this stuff in the book. You need to know it, but that's what it is in a nutshell. The NIST 800-154, which is the Guide to Data-Centric System Threat Modeling, takes a 4-step approach. Identify and characterize the systems and data of interest. Identify and select the attack vectors to be included in the model. Characterize the security controls for mitigating the attack vectors, and then analyze the threat model. Simplicity is security's best friend. DREAD is a mnemonic quantitative risk rating, damage, reproducibility, exploitability, affected users' discoverability. This is a leftover relic from the old days of Microsoft in the 90s. I don't know too many people that are still running that. Operational Critical Threat Asset Vulnerability Evaluation, or OCTAV, developed by the Software Engineering Institute. Trike is another framework that focuses on threat models as a risk management tool that is open source. Chorus, construct a platform for risk analysis of security critical systems. This is a project out of Europe, and it has a very heavy reliance on unified modeling language, or UML. Oh my gosh, the frameworks are everywhere. So many frameworks. Pick one, any one will do. All right, now we're going to get into supply chain management. Most systems are going to be interconnected. No one today that I'm aware of is growing and building their own systems and software completely on an island. They are using somebody else's something from somewhere. Okay, we want to evaluate the entirety of the supply chain and ensure that the appropriate controls are in place to manage risk. So this includes things like vendor risk. What's our vendor doing? What is our procurement model? What is how are we getting things? How do we know what we got is good? We want to ensure that the security controls that we have in place are aligned to any legal requirements, contractual obligations, and organizational policies. And shocker, but the cloud is still your responsibility to secure. Okay, just because it's in the cloud doesn't make it not your problem. We got to look at our third parties for risk. You want to have a third-party risk management policy that enforces assessing, monitoring, and controlling those risks. Governance and oversight should include on-site surveys, formal audits, third-party systems, and penetration testing. You should be onboarding all new third parties through a risk assessment process that is aligned to your organizational security requirements. More on this in Chapter 6. We are nearing the finish line. So for those of you that got to go, it's been a great night. And for the rest of you, we'll be wrapped up here in just another couple minutes. We want to look at our minimum security requirements. So MSR, this is similar to our baselines and our standards. This is that bare bar. It is the minimum amount of security required for any vendor or others in the supply chain. Absolutely should be minimum, and minimum should include any legal, contractual, or regulatory requirements. We want to make sure that our minimum security requirements are never below any external security compliance requirement that we're held to. And we want to audit and assess all of our third-party compliance with any minimum security requirement that we have established. Service level agreements. This is a contract agreement between the service provider and the customer. This sets up the minimum performance standards and serves as a documented and agreed upon performance requirement. You would use the SLA to enforce any type of financial compensation or a right to terminate the contract if the provider does not meet the SLA. Here again, another framework, because frameworks. NIST has the IR 7622. What it does, it looks at the supply chain elements, process, and actors. The goal is to limit access and exposure within the supply chain, establish and maintain the provenance of the elements, processes, tools, and data, limit information sharing very strictly, and perform risk management awareness and training on the supply chain. Continuing on, we want to use defensive design for this. Continuous integrator review. This is aligned to the National Security Systems Directive 505 for supply chain risk management. For those of you in DoD or working with any government, this would apply to you. More ISO. This one is not specific to security. If you're an ISO organization, take a look at it. It is very reliant on the model of plan, do, check, act. The UK has one. For those of you that are over there, there are 12 principles broken into 3 stages, but you'll notice a common theme through all this. Understand what your risks are, get control over them, check in on what people are actually doing, and then try to improve. Social engineering, security champions, and gaming. So now we're talking about awareness training. Again, care and aware, different things, but social engineering, if you don't know, is how we exploit human weaknesses. Phishing is going to be that most common method. Vishing, which is phone call phishing. Smishing is text-based phishing. Social media, please stop taking the spirit animal survey. If you don't know what your spirit animal is, today isn't the day to find out. Impersonations, another big one. Deep fakes and mimicking of writing styles. We're seeing that increase. So make sure that your users are trained on what to look out for, but more importantly, who to report the stuff to. Who do I tell? When do I tell an adult? Very important thing for our users to be trained on and understand. A well-trained user can become our security champions. Security champions are the liaison between us crazy security people and the rest of the business. They're going to advocate for security best practices within their teams. They do not work on the security team. That should not be your security champion. Your champion should be someone from some other team. And if your organization is big enough, you should have one from each department or team. Gamification can be very powerful in teaching because it's making it fun. It's bringing some fun and some awareness to it. It makes security more relatable and it improves engagement. Don't beat them to death with a slide deck like I've done to you tonight. Have a conversation and try to work in some humor. We got to review everything, okay? Constant change is the norm. So reviewing our awareness content regularly to ensure that it's actually aligned to the current emerging threats is very important. At a minimum, we should be doing this once a year. We want to get rid of any outdated terms or technology references, or just get rid of technology references. I say that tongue in cheek. Should reflect current security trends, concepts, and concerns. CISSPs absolutely need to be involved in the development of training content that is testable. Know that. All right, almost there. Security awareness should be formally evaluated for effectiveness. Feel free, if you don't know how to do that, reach out to one of us here in the mentor program. We can definitely help you out and get the right resources. You want to make sure you're tracking training metrics. Who's taking it, who's not taking it, how far along are they, how are they doing? We want to make sure that we're testing for understanding. You know, I don't just want awareness, I want retention. We should have a day or a week, and please capture feedback. You know, is it working? Does it make sense? You know, that feedback can be so valuable to creating effective security training. We want to do, again, who to report. So we want that inherent evaluation. Woo, you made it. Domain 1 done. Oh, good stuff. Only 6 minutes over. Yeah. All right. Next session, Ron's up. I had not Ryan because I had not yet looked at the schedule, but Ron's going to take us through domain 2, which is asset security. We're going to go through identification and classification of information and assets, asset handling requirements, provision and inventory management roles, data lifecycle and controls. Domain 1 is done. Oh, thank goodness. Here's your homework. Read domain 2. Start taking those practice tests. Review at least 2 of the references that we've provided in this class, download them for later use, and please post at least 1 question or answer in the Slack channel. I appreciate all of you being here tonight. Hopefully you found this a good use of your time and you learned something new. Feel free to connect with any of us via the Slack channels or any of the other ways we've provided for you to get in touch with us. And with that, I thank you for attending class 3 of the FRSecure CISSP Mentor Program. I was your instructor, Ryan Cloutier. It has been a pleasure and a privilege. How is that, sir?
You rock, Ryan.
All right. Well, hopefully I didn't miss anything or butcher it too bad. To be honest.
By the way, we're still on YouTube.
Okay. Yeah, I'll shut her down. All right, man. Have a good one.
Bye, everyone.
See you, everybody.